So welcome to another episode of From the Studio. This is the stories from the world of product design brought to you by PDM International. It's a one in a series where we talk about everything from innovation to funding and lots in between. Our objective is to inspire our audience to think about how innovation works in their business, how access to funding can help to support them, and everything to do with their product design and product development journey. So without further ado, let me tell you about our guest today. I'm Nick Bramley, the podcast host, co-hosted by Richard Hall, who is the Managing Director at PDM International, also the From the Studio guru, as it were. But the most important person on the podcast today is our guest, Ian Newington. Ian is Head of Special Projects at LGC's Grant Management Group. He's got a lot to share with us, and I can't wait to get into that. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Richard and Ian.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hello.
You're more than welcome. We've got a lot to get through. I've put some ideas and thoughts together for a few questions to take us on a bit of a journey, so I hope you don't mind with that. Really appreciate you giving up your time for us today, and hopefully the audience who are sharing and listening to this will be inspired by where we take them. So no pressure. We'll kick off. We'll kick off from there. Okay. So, Ian, for the benefit of the audience, can you give us a little bit of background about LGC Grant Management Group, particularly its involvement and the commissioning arm of NIHR, the National Institute for Health and Care Research, which is where we sort of know you from?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So LGC used to be called the Laboratory of the Government Chemist, so part of the original Scientific Civil Service, privatized back in sometime in mid-90s. But because of the expertise in government contracts, was involved in life sciences generally anyway, and got involved when the NIHR was first formed back in 2006. Well, they were already doing some managing some grant funding through, actually for medtech primarily. They probably ran the first SBRI healthcare, one of the first SBRI healthcare calls. So they put in a bid for part of the NIHR, which was what then called the Central Commissioning Facility, and won that, and that's kind of grown like Topsy ever since, I think. So that was back in about 2006 when NIHR started. We're now an organisation. I wasn't there at the time. I've been in the organisation about 8 years. We're now an organisation of about 250 people, so it's grown quite a lot even in the last 2 or 3 years. And we manage probably about a third of the NIHR's annual spend of about 1.3 billion. So it's about 450 million a year of spending on research. But we also have, that's our biggest contract, clearly. We also have contracts with NHS England, which is the SBRI healthcare programme. So it's part of the Accelerated Access Innovation Funding. And alongside that, we're also working with the NHS England cancer team on the cancer innovation programme. So we've been running calls for them. We were also working with NHSX when it existed. We're still working with the AI lab on the AI in Health and Care Award. So that's been a part of our team. So the team that I sit in is innovations. What we call innovations. We run the NIHR's I4I programme as well. So, and it's the same team that does SBRI and so on. So we're doing all things medtech in that sense. The rest of the organization does everything from engagement, dissemination, and a number of other research funding programs, and pretty much all of the infrastructure, biomedical research centers. In this context, probably people will be familiar with the MICs, the medtech and in vitro diagnostic cooperatives. So they're part of our infrastructure, which is managed from the office where I'm based. So LGC's grant management is quite wide. We've also got a number of touch bases in other places as well. So we're involved in a small project in Italy, helping with some funding, and we do some work in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland as well. So.
No wonder you're a busy man and hard to track down. So it's been a while getting you onto this with busy diaries. So I can understand why now, Ian. It looks like we'll explore your job role shortly. But I think the relationship that you've got with Richard and the team at PDM sort of revolves around the NIHR. And that's where sort of collaboration's been before. So we'd like to explore a little bit about that in terms of, the National Institute for Health and Care Research. It's quite a significant body. Can you tell us a bit about that in a bit more detail? So what its role is, who it serves, what it provides in terms of services kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So as a whole, as I mentioned, it's about a 1.2, 1.3 billion a year, and it's going up slightly according to spending review, assuming we stick with that. It's really the arm. It's a NIHR actually is not an organization per se. It's a brand really for funding of the Department of Health and Social Care, and so which funds in the research. So we basically pick up in the area of translational funding and clinical research. So anything that comes before that, really sort of basic research, would be funded by UKRI through the research councils typically, and NIHR is there to pick up all of that, and we things that happen afterwards. So translation into the clinic, and then clinical evidence generation through clinical trials, and obviously the clinical research network for running clinical trials in the NHS is a key part of the NIHR. So it does touch on all of those kind of areas. In terms of the things that I guess the people listening here are going to be interested in terms of the kind of medtech space, particularly, and working with small companies. That's again quite a key area for us, and we have two bits of the organisation: the innovations team themselves, who are involved in the funding, and that's as you mentioned, that's partly how I met with Richard. I think originally because he was involved in a project with one of your previous podcast speakers, and we've met a few times in various conversations around some of that and some other applications. But we also have a team that for doing business development. We call business development, and whose job it is to try and help connect probably the 25,000 odd people that we fund through NIHR, you can probably find experts in almost any unmet need area of disease, and with industry. So there's an opportunity and that's a free service. So we provide that kind of linkage. So small companies especially often need KOLs, whether it's for a science advisory board or something like that, or they might need people to collaborate with who are going to be in the NHS. So that's one of the key things about NIHR. All of our what we call infrastructure, which is mostly people rather than actual hard facilities, although there are a few of those. It's mostly people, and they're all of that is based in an NHS organisation. So usually accompanied with a university or maybe more than one in collaboration, but nearly everything is based and inside the NHS. So we're very well connected into the health service. So bringing that research and things together. So we can do that connection. We can help people access sites for running their clinical trials as well, and as well as a number of other things like how do you do applications. We might come on to this perhaps a bit later, but when people think of NIHR as very academic and quite difficult for small companies to apply. We hear that a lot, particularly in my team. But we do have organisation out there which is currently called the Research Design Service. It's going to change its name after the summer. It'll be then called the Research. What's it called? It's RSS instead of RDS. Research. I can't even remember what it stands for now. But they'll be doing a little bit more around methodology, so they understand the NIHR approach to applications, the kind of the flavors and the things that we want. They're also, because we're funded and they're independent of the organization or the secretariat, they're able to review people's applications and make comments and actually support them in doing that. So yeah, there's a number of ways that you can access and get support, and pretty much all of it's for free if you're a small company.
Excellent. We're going to explore your networks later on. We're going to explore the sort of navigating the funding a bit later on as well. But Richard, coming to you, I know PDM have previously worked on projects with the NIHR. Do you want to share some insights into what that was like for a smaller business, getting access to that kind of project level and that group of people?
Yeah, sure. So the kind of touch points that we've had is with I4I Connect, which we'll talk about a bit later, hopefully, and also the FAST Award. But probably the most prominent was an I4I PDA, Product Development Award, which we did in collaboration with the University of Leeds. In terms of the process, it was quite a large budget that was needed to take the project forward, and as a result, the process was incredibly robust, kind of nerve-wracking as well. But I think that there are various funds for various appetites. So, for example, the FAST is relatively straightforward, but the I4I PDA was pretty robust, and it was right down to an interview at the RSA in London where we thought it was would be a kind of a formality, and it was effectively a grilling. But you kind of expect those things. But if anybody goes for funding, any types of funding, expect to have a level of grilling, but that's only really to protect the interest of the grant that's being funded anyway. So,
okay, we're going to loop round the question a little bit, and we're going to cover the funding issue because it follows on from your kind of experience, Richard. There, Ian, I want to explore that kind of access to funding that sometimes companies are a bit nervous of, quite difficult to navigate. They think it's there's a lot of barriers to overcome. So, I guess how do LGC's grant management group and perhaps the NIHR work in terms of that access, and how do you manage kind of taking people through the process? Because I guess the end game is you want people to be successful because you want to award the funds, don't you?
No, exactly. So just to be absolutely clear, so the job that I do and the job that our team are about, and what most of the NIHR, we call ourselves secretariat. So basically, we manage the process to make that happen. So all the decisions about who gets the funding or who's recommended for funding is done by independent assessors. So we have committees that are set up, which we manage, and we try to source and so on, but to cover all the kind of areas of expertise, both clinical and in our case for I4I, in particular, we'll have commercial. We've got VCs on the committee and so on. So we manage that process to make sure applications come in. But obviously we are an interface with applicants. We can help answer questions. There's a little bit of a limit as to how far we can go, which is why, and it's the Research Support Service, the S, I found out, remember what it stood for. One of the things they can do is some of the stuff that we can't do, and the mixer similarly, is that they can help you in more detailed ways in terms of looking at your application and reading it through and advising you and helping you with that. That's one of the things I can't do, but one of the things that our team will do, we provide we've got a team inbox for questions like, I've got this widget that I'm making that does this and this. Is this something, and I want to do this with it? Is this something that's eligible for your funding? That's the sort of simplest question we deal with. Mostly that's done by our operations team. Those kind of questions are relatively simple. Occasionally we end up with situations where it's not entirely clear whether it's quite in remit or not, and then in which case someone in the program team, specifically one of our who's got a bit more experience of working with in this space and understands and can sort of think through the issues, will get involved in dealing with that. So there's always someone from the team there to answer questions. So we can sort of we manage that process, and when people have applied, they'll get some feedback and things at whatever stage, whether they're successful or not, for most of the things that we fund. And when it comes to, so it's worth also saying that pretty much all of our applications are two-stage processes, apart from FAST, which we'll probably touch on a bit later. And if you get shortlisted to go into stage 2, the letter that comes to you will have a name on it. And sometimes that name's me, sometimes it'll be someone else in the team. And then there's a person at the other end you can have conversation with, and we can help signpost you, point you, connect you to some of the things that help. But kind of taking that step back into getting into it in the first place, obviously we advertise, we promote the calls as widely as we can. We work with organisations like Medilinks through the AHSNs, as well as sort of some direct communications with, particularly with people that we've that we know and we funded, but we try to make sure that the community more widely knows. And we've got quite a wide network with a number of accelerators and clusters and other organizations who will get the email, and then we can pass that information across to and obviously universities as well, and NHS organizations that are doing research will also be on the mailing list, so they'll get prompted about when calls are coming up and when they're going to be available. So yeah, so there's quite a lot goes on there. You're right, and Richard is absolutely right. PDA is probably that's our flagship, I guess, our flagship program. And on average, we're awarding about $1 million, about 1.1 million for one of those awards over roughly up to a 3-year period. It varies a little bit, and sometimes it's more than that. So my conversation quite often with SMEs is, well, you know, you're going for investment, you're going to talk to an investor. How long does it take you to raise $1 million if you were going to a private investor? And when they tell me it's a minimum of 6 months, and there's still no guarantee they're going to get it. Well, so that's basically where we are with the product development award. It is a 6 to 7 month process. Obviously, there isn't a guarantee that you're going to get awarded, and it's a pretty robust process. But it's not dissimilar to other ways of raising that kind of sum of money.
Okay, well, I mean, to be fair, the only guarantee of not getting awarded is not applying in the first place.
Oh,
isn't
absolutely,
it?
absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
No
so
problem.
we're really keen to, and we're really keen in the, I guess, in the last probably in the last maybe 5 years or so, under our previous program director, there was a very strong emphasis on trying to increase the number of SMEs that we have as lead organisations. So we're largely in NIHR until very recently, we were the only program that has awarded made awards to SMEs as lead organisations. Most of the rest of NIHR will fund NHS or university organisations. I4I does fund SMEs as lead organisations. In fact, one of our streams, the Connect stream, you have to be an SME to be as a lead to actually apply to it. We're actually starting to see a little bit of a change, and one of the other programmes, I can't say which at the moment because it hasn't been publicly announced. They haven't finished the contracting, but there is one of the other programs that's now actually funded. In fact, it was one of the companies that we'd funded previously through I4I has just picked up another award through one of the programs that doesn't normally do that. So it's interesting times and changes and developments.
Excellent. Well, Richard, let's pick up on your experience as an SME managing director. How much difference does access to funding and the award of funding make to the chance of success? Obviously, medical device, life sciences projects, yes, you need money, but if you get that funding in place, what difference does it make to a project delivery?
It makes a huge difference, particularly with an SME that, Ian's mentioned a few times. Innovation equals risk, R&D equals risk, and some businesses who have, even small organizations that have a truly brilliant innovation just can't raise those funds either privately because it would take too long or because it's just too high risk. So the great thing about NIHR is you are effectively kind of sharing that risk. And for a lot of companies, that is the start point of a journey. And it's kind of a snowball effect. But NIHR, is kind of what I'd like to get across partly is that NIHR, some people see it as a facade, that it's a funding body, but you go behind that facade and there is a whole series of people, infrastructure that can help you on that journey. It allows you to access people that you wouldn't normally access, basically. And it's all, as Dean said, it's all free as well.
Excellent. Okay, Ian, I'm going to come to the I4I FAST Award. I saw a LinkedIn post recently, but it was a month or two ago, so it's probably missed the recent deadline. But you're promoting this NIHR I4I FAST Award. Do you want to tell us a bit about what the award is, and I guess what we need to keep an eye on for when, if there's a deadline on it and it's passed, then when's the next one kind of thing? Okay,
so FAST stands for Funding at the Speed of Translation. It was a nice acronym that was put together by our current program director, Mike Lewis. The idea is it's that relatively small level of money between about 15 and 50K over 3 to 6 months to kind of address a single specific piece of work. So a gap in the evidence that you've got, a gap, something you need that's going to release something, the next stage, which is going to get you either it's investment, or it might be the point where you need to be in order to apply for, say, a PDA or that really next big step. So it's quite possibly a go no go kind of decision point. You need to do that. Now you still need to be in IFRI terms. You still need to have your proof of concept. So you've got to be at TRL3 with your technology. So that's across the board with IFRI. But nonetheless, it's a quick process, and obviously it's designed to do that. The idea is 6 weeks from your submission to you getting an answer whether you've got the money or not. It is actually still open at the moment. So we're running a second pilot. So probably the post that you saw may well have been the beginning of just before Christmas when we started our second pilot. We weren't expecting to run it again quite so soon, but a friendly person in the Department of Health put their hand down the back of the sofa and came out with some money, and so they encouraged us to run this call again. So we at rather short notice, we've made a few tweaks and changes to the first pilot that we ran, but we're still calling it a pilot because we're still learning about the process, and there are some things that we want to do. So we'll be assessing this call and the last one. So the idea is you don't actually know when there's a deadline as an applicant. You can apply anytime you want. It's a relatively simple process. There's basically 3 questions, a bit of information about who you are and your company or your organization, because it's also open to academics as well. And basically the three kind of key questions, what is it what's your technology? What have you got? What's your value proposition? What's the unmet need kind of thing? Where's the evidence gap? What is it you're trying to do and why? And what's that next step? What's that going to release? So it's those kind of 3 key kind of questions, relatively short applications. So there's some fairly strong word, limits on that. And it goes out to 2 or 3 external reviewers. We've got a pool of reviewers who are waiting for these things to come. So we know internally when we're going to have a close date. And whatever's come in at that point, we'll do a quick check for eligibility, and then assuming they're eligible, they get shipped off to be reviewed, and we get scored. And basically it's a relatively simple: is it fundable? Isn't it? And if you get 2 fundables, you got funded, and then you'll get the letter to say. And then in theory, although we haven't quite managed it in practice yet, you get the money before you start, or you get 90% of it anyway up front. The downside of that is if you're a new supplier to the department, it sometimes takes a little while to get onto the system and get actually paid. But that's the idea: you get 90%, and then the 10% is held until you finish the thing and done a quick report on what you've actually done. So it's still going at the moment. We've still got some more money to spend. Can't say how long it will continue to go, but it's clearly a popular scheme, and we're hoping that the department are going to fund that on a so the idea is this is a continuous call, so it's always open. But we need a bigger budget to do that, and we obviously need an additional resource in the team to manage that on an ongoing basis. But that's what FAST is all about, and it's to kind of leverage that next big step.
I mean, you need a bigger settee, don't you, to go and find the cash behind, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of that capital injection of 15 to 50,000 for a quick move through a process, that's really, really kind of valuable, isn't it, to somebody at a very key stage of a project. So thanks for sharing that, and we will share that widely with our audience as well. I want to talk about projects really, Ian, without breaching any confidentiality or maybe naming names, but you must have worked on some really good projects that have really pleased you, that the NIHR have supported. Which have you got any favourites without sort of,
Well, one of the most interesting, I was actually talking to someone else this morning about this. It became badged as NIHR. In fact, it was originally a joint scheme between the department and NIHR and Wellcome Trust. It used to be called the Health Innovation Challenge Fund, and I was involved in as the kind of funders representative for a project by Professor Sharon Peacock, which was about doing genetic sequencing of pathogens. And it is at the time it was that when they got awarded, between then and when the project, as soon as the project started, really, the cost of sequencing was coming way down. And so the project carried on because they kept finding things of value to do with the money that they were saving on the sequencing costs. And it carried on and it carried on. And funnily enough, in February of 2020, there was a phone call to the team from Professor Peacock to say, from tomorrow, we are sequencing COVID, because they had the whole team and all the infrastructure and all of the sequencing and all the networks were in place, and all the software and the pipelines and stuff was all in place to do it. And that became UK COG. So that was really interesting to be involved in that right from very early in that development, and see what happened to that and how important that became, and the technology that was developed through that. So that was just one example, which I can tell you about the name of. That's probably one of the best ones that I've been involved with.
You'd have to say talk about timing and right place, etc. on that
Absolutely.
one, given what happened at the start of 2020. I'm assuming though that you do as an organisation fund applications that don't actually then succeed.
Yes.
What are the implications there if an organisation or a SME applies for funding and then it doesn't deliver what the expected outcome would be?
So it's a very good question, because obviously research is still risky, and Richard mentioned that. And so whilst by the time you get to us, mostly a lot of those kind of key issues around the technology will probably have been bottomed out. Actually taking something and making it into a manufacturable prototype is not a trivial exercise, and there can be all sorts of slips and trips along the way, and that does sometimes happen. And sometimes when you start to bring several pieces together which work quite nicely, but then and there's an innovative step somewhere in there, and that just turns out to be really quite tricky. So sometimes it doesn't work for technological reasons, and we had an example of that. Happened actually at the point where I was managing the team, and the senior program manager came along and said that they've tried something which they didn't tell us about, which wasn't a great thing. So they kept us out of the loop. Which said the first thing is we don't give your funder any surprises. Just tell us stuff, because it's all confidential. We much rather not have surprises when those things happen. Yeah. But in the end, it became clear that what they wanted to do couldn't be done. So we had a conversation. We ended up, by mutual agreement, really, was clearly this was a no-go. They're not going to be able to deliver what was anticipated, and the next step would have been to go to a clinical trial. And the plan B, which wasn't really what was originally intended, and therefore kind of didn't really meet what they'd been awarded for, involved a clinical trial, and they couldn't get their ethics approval. And when we looked at it, we understood why they couldn't get their ethics approval. So we took it back to the committee and said, what's your and everybody said, they're never going to get ethics approval to do that. This is not what we agreed to fund them for. So we had the conversation, and by sort of mutual agreement, we agreed to terminate that project. So so it's fair to say that it's worth saying that when you get an NIHR, you're actually signing a contract to deliver something, and that's part of, if you're an SME, that's part of the basis on which we're able to give you 100% funding. So that's one thing that's worth thinking about, which we haven't really mentioned yet on NIHR funding. For small companies, is that you can get 100% funding, so there isn't any match funding requirement. But part of that's because you've signed a contract, and in the contract it says what your milestones are and what your expected outcomes are. So it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it just doesn't happen because it can't, or other things get in the way and come along. More often, I would say, problems that arise it's delivery within the timescale. Things take longer than you anticipate, especially currently with the state of the NHS, and the fact is getting time from clinicians and people to actually be involved in what you're doing. It sometimes takes a lot longer to get those things to happen. But it's often, and I say to a lot of people, it's you know how to solve the technical problems, because that's what most of the people that come to us with these things are people who've invented something, or they're technical, they understand what they're doing. that's not the problem most often. Most often the problem is all the other stuff. It's the regulatory, it's the making sure they develop the right evidence, it's getting the right protocol for doing their clinical evaluation. Those are the things, and DTAC, if it's a digital, complying with all the various standards and things, getting in, if it's information that's, you're exchanging information with, say, electronic health records, you need to connect into the system. It's information governance, going through the committee, making sure you've got all of that stuff lined up. Those are the things that cause more problems actually for our projects than the technology usually.
Let's take your steer on that, Richard. Obviously, from a PDM international point of view, you work around product development, product design, innovation, etc. In your experience, then, how typical is that Ian suggested there, that a project might start with a certain end goal or ambition, and for whatever reason, those expectations just simply don't get delivered, and the journey falls apart? Are there any common themes that you see from organizations that are, I don't say doomed to failure, but they don't set off on the right path? What's your view on that from a product development perspective?
It depends how long you've got, but I'll give you an abbreviated version. Usually, this is our space, this is where we sit. So usually a company, an SME, an organization will be fixated on the technology and have an assumption that the technology will drive its way all the way through to adoption. But the reality is, as Ian said, there are lots of things hanging off the innovation. So usability, human-centered design, cost of manufacture, route to manufacture, key opinion leaders, and adopting, listening to KOLs in terms of their thought process, technology obsolescence. There are so many things that can hijack what is in its own right truly a good innovation. And it is a common theme that we see a lot. So when we meet with new clients, whether it's a small SME or a very large kind of, PLC, we always ask those hard-hitting questions early on, because at some point in that journey, it will get hijacked. And I think the main takeaway for me is, don't get fixated on what it is. Think about what it does. That's where the value proposition is. And I think generally, having an awareness of risk is good, but I think you need to bring people on this journey with you and have that fundamental understanding before you start to kind of proceed. So it's a big area, but I completely concur with Ian on all of that.
Okay, thank you. Ian, an area of interest for me, just on a professional level, is the value of someone's professional network and how they build that. Now, I've had a look on your LinkedIn profile, because that's where a podcast host gets a lot of information, a background on the guests. And you mentioned, I've got a phrase here, you've got a strong external focus demonstrated by building effective networks and working effectively with academic and contract research organizations. So first of all, how have you been able to build your networks over your career, and how important have they been in you delivering your work?
Yeah, so a lot of that actually was probably what was in my CV when I last wrote it. Because in my previous role, I've been in my current role about 8 years. In my previous role, I worked for GE Healthcare in their imaging diagnostics team. And one of the things I did there was I was working developing some early new projects in looking for opportunities in the neurodegenerative imaging space or diagnostic space. So we had to do quite a lot of work around thinking about alternatives to imaging, because imaging is quite expensive and takes a long time to develop. So the company didn't want to pay for it, so they said, go and find some partners, go and find some money, grant funding preferably, that we don't have to pay for to do some of that really early experimentation. So that was part of, I guess, what I was doing. And along the side of that, I'm a chemist by training, and one of the things we were doing also was running a few new projects to look for some novel compounds that might be useful as imaging agents. So we outsourced some of that to some contract research. So I got involved in some of that management. But so in terms of the network, absolutely, it's been really probably as important knowing how to build the network, or the fact that you need a network rather than actually necessarily the actual network itself. Clearly, I guess it would have got me several jobs if I hadn't been happy where I am in the meantime, because I get quite a lot of people saying, well, are you interested in a in a job here or there or that, whatever. It's also to a large extent, increasingly, I guess now, it's also a way of getting the news out there about things like FAST, as you saw, because now the network of people that we've funded, people I've worked with, organizations and people in organizations such as yourselves, but as I mentioned already, Medilinks and some of the AHSNs and so on, those kind of things, when you post those up, they're in my network, so they automatically pick this stuff up. It gets forwarded and it gets cascaded out. So all of a sudden, we're finding we're getting to a and it's not just me, obviously. This is also other people in the team are doing similar things, and we're starting now to find that we're getting to people and to companies that previously didn't know about us because of that kind of cascade and that network. So that's really helpful. And obviously, opportunities to people ask you for stuff sometimes, but also you can ask them. I still had a really interesting conversation to do with traumatic brain injury with one of my former colleagues at GE's corporate research lab just before Christmas, because I knew they were doing something we were interested in following up in that area, particularly around concussion. Pediatric concussion actually was the interest that we were looking at, and I knew they'd done some stuff when I'd been there, and I wanted to find out what had happened and if there'd been any more development. So I had really interesting conversation with a guy that was doing that, who I'd know. So those kind of things, pop out of nowhere sometimes, and that having that network sometimes can be really helpful.
Okay, I mean, it's plugging people together as well, isn't it? In terms of funders looking for support and experts, and that kind of thing. Richard, I know I'm gonna come to you one final question, Richard, before I finish with Ian. I know that you're making a conscious effort to be much more visible and out there representing PDM in some really sort of specific networks and targeted areas in 2023. So why do you see that as important to you as an SME business with an innovation studio to get out there and continue to grow your networks?
Good question. Because innovation in its own right is great, but what we're about is taking our clients further, and you'll see a lot more of this. We take you further, and it's all about leadership, collaboration. It's all about navigating clients through this incredibly complex journey called innovation. It's about shared risk, and it's also about being process driven. So what we're about is, yes, we're an innovation agency and effectively, product design, but we are much more than that. We are very much practitioners actively hooked into over 50 networks. And what we are good at doing is joining all of those dots for our clients so that they get to where they need to be safely, cost effectively, and that's effectively what we do. My role now is getting out there and exposing ourselves more to those networks and our value proposition. So that's kind of my role, and we've got a great team. We're doing some really, really interesting things in medtech and life sciences. It's just making sure that more people know about us, basically.
So you'll have the same benefit as Ian as you publish material and things like this podcast series. The bigger the network, the wider the reach and the wider the sort of scope of engagement, I guess.
It's about sharing knowledge. It's about sharing knowledge. It's a very difficult journey. And what we want to do is share knowledge and help people with their kind of process.
Excellent. Final question for you, Ian. You've been fabulous to share lots of really interesting things. This is just a bit about what's on your to-do list for the rest of this quarter. And if anything, what you're really looking forward to over the rest of 2023. We're recording this early February, so you've got another 11 months ahead of you. What's on your to-do list, and what does 2023 look like for you, Ian?
Yeah, so it's rapidly my to-do list has rapidly increased in the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's suddenly ramped up quite a lot of activity. I guess a lot of the key things just at the moment are, well, we're in the middle of we're doing some shortlisting for some of our programs funding at the moment. So our product development award, we have a shortlisting meeting on Monday. So we're rapidly sort of reviewing what our panel assessors have kind of scored things to have a look at that. So we'll be running that process on Monday. I guess I'm also mostly involved in things that's taking a lot of my time, and at least my thinking time at the moment, is around some events that we're going to be involved with. So Intelligent Health at Edexcel in May. We're involved there, so that's all about AI and data-driven technologies. So we're going as an NIHR. We got a stand, and we're running one of the challenge sessions for the organisers, as we're one of the sort of strategic partners. We've got some activities. We're also going to MTI, which I think was the last time we actually met in person. Richard was at NEC in June. So we got a multi-funder stand. So we're obviously from LGC's perspective, SBRI and NIHR, but also we're sharing the stand with UKRI as well, and we're going to run a pitch session again. We're sponsoring the startup zone, and we've got some really good companies that we've targeted who are going to hopefully be coming on the startup zone and pitching that. And we're going to run some events, an hour and a half session for around some of the difficulties of or understanding some of the issues about getting into the NHS. So we've got an ex-clinical coder who can tell people about actually how things get costed and how that works through, what the costs are for things like diagnostics. How do you get paid for doing a diagnostic, and then also some of those things about who are the people you need to go and pitch to, and how does all that work in the kind of new environment. So we're running again jointly across the funders. So that's a big thing. Quite a lot of activity going on there, and as a wider team, we've got quite a lot of activities in terms of showcasing. We're heading towards another a big showcase event sometime in June at the Crick Institute, where we get a chance to show off our portfolio. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's a really good opportunity. We bring in people from I guess people who we funded even further ago than we funded you, Richard, with that PDA, who've some of those companies that have kind of gone on to exit really, or just about made it, or well on the market and doing some really good. So last time we had Quantum DX came and talked about where they got to, and we funded a really early piece of their work, a couple of awards, right down to the other end where we've just literally funded someone to do a Connect project, and they're just about starting on the journey. So we've got exposing across the whole portfolio all of that range of different levels of things that we do as an organization. So that really looking forward to that one. And then the other activity that I'm looking at with events through the year, which again, really looking forward to getting some of this bottomed out a little bit, and that's our SME Roadshow. So we've been trying to, because we know that a lot of SMEs don't know enough about the NIHR. If they know about the NIHR, they might know we do a bit of funding. They might not think it's relevant. Hopefully after this, more people will think it is. But also they don't know about those other services and things that we do. We know that because we've done the survey a couple of times now. So we're trying to do a bit of a roadshow around roughly once a quarter. We got kicked in the teeth with the rail strikes last year, so we didn't get as many done as we'd hoped to, but we're hoping to in fact we're hoping to come to Leeds. I've got to talk to Nexus. It looks like I might have a budget, which is good, and I'd quite like to come to Nexus at some point later in the year, and actually run an event in Leeds. Looking to do something in London with MedCity, probably that's around diagnostics most likely, because that's what their main focus is that now, and something in the Northwest, which again, that was one of the ones that got kicked by the rail touched by the rail strikes back in September. So we're trying to work with some of the stakeholders as well as the SMEs. So some of the organisations like the Medilinks, like the HSNs, accelerators, and people who are already supporting the SMEs, who will hopefully remember what our offer is, and be able to articulate that, because SMEs, unless they need it now, they don't always remember when it comes around to that need, and they're going to go to someone like the Medilinks, or they go to people like yourselves. And if you know what we're about and what the opportunities are, we can manage that. So I will say, I will give one email address for your listeners. If you need access to anything that I've talked about today, whether it's funding, whether it's people, whether it's clinical trial sites, that kind of thing, the email address you need is industry@nihr.ac.uk. That will get you into the whole system, and it will get triaged to the funding teams, to the business development for connections or to the clinical trials network, and so on. So that's the one you need, industry@nihr.ac.uk. It's a single front door, finally. It's taken a long time to get there, but we finally managed to do that in the last year. So use that email address if you've got questions, and we can pick that up with you.
We'll put those in the podcast notes. Thank you for sharing that. What I would say about your plan for 2023 is it's great to be back out, isn't it? You know, we've
Absolutely
had a couple of years of that kind of hybrid, not at all, you know, social distancing, all that kind. To be back out and facing the audience again and engaging with people face to face, that can only be a great thing. So listening, all it remains for me to say is thank you for being a fantastic guest, sharing some really good insights with us. All that I'm going to do now is just share with you the contact details for From the Studio. From the Studio is brought to you by PDM International, of which Richard is the managing director. We're based in Thirsk. We're also based in Leeds at the platform. Contact details on the screen if you watch it on YouTube, but contact details are also in the show notes and on the website when you see the link to this particular episode. So thank you very much for your time, Richard. Thank you very much for your time, Ian. We appreciate that. And we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.